Rolex is one of the world's most luxurious brands and currently worth about $8 billion. But what if I told you that its incredible journey started a century ago with a teenager who had lost everything? This determined young orphan left his hometown, moved to a new country, and after years of hard work, pursued his dream by starting a watchmaking business. Unbeknownst to him, this venture would transform wristwatches and evolve into a billion-dollar empire. But before we go any further, welcome to Tales of Titans, the place where business and history come to life. So, let's delve into the amazing story of Hans Wilsdorf and the creation of Rolex. Now, Hans Wilsdorf, born on March 22, 1881 in Kumbach, Germany, to Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf, was the second of three kids. His family had a decent business selling iron goods, but tragically, his mother passed away in 1892, and a year later, he lost his father too, leaving him orphaned at 12. His uncles took over and sent him and his siblings to a prestigious boarding school in Bavaria. Hans didn't like this move and found it tough to fit in, often feeling like an outsider. To cope, he focused on his studies. He excelled in math and languages, learning French and English, skills that would later help him in his career. He also became friends with a Swiss boy who told him about La Chaux-de-Fonds, a Swiss city known for its watchmaking history. Hans was fascinated by this, and it sparked his interest in the industry. Looking back, Hans realized that the tough decisions made by his uncles, which he initially resented, played a big part in his success. He once said, "The way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life, it's to this that much of my success is due." At the age of 19, Hans decided he needed a change. He left his boarding school in Germany and moved to Geneva, Switzerland. There, he landed a job as an apprentice at an international pearl exporting company. This company was big into buying and sorting pearls for jewelers, and Hans noticed they weren't really creating anything but still made a lot of profit. He dived in, learning their business tactics, and even for his young age, he was making good money. Then, out of the blue, Hans got a letter from a friend offering him a job at Kuno Korten, a top-tier watchmaking company in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a place Hans had always dreamed of visiting. Kuno Korten was a big deal, exporting Swiss watches worth millions and even making some of their own. So despite his current job being more profitable, Hans's curiosity about watches and this new place was too strong to ignore. So, in 1900, he moved to La Chaux-de-Fonds to work for Kuno Korten. At Kuno Korten, Hans worked as an English correspondent and clerk, thanks to his English skills from school. He earned 80 Swiss francs a month, winding hundreds of pocket watches daily and ensuring their accuracy. In just 2 years, he learned a lot about watchmaking. But his adventure was cut short. Hans had to return to Germany for military service, and after serving, at 22, he moved to London, England, to work with another high-end watch company. This time, he had a bigger role, focusing on boosting sales. Over 2 years, he expanded their client base and increased sales. By then, Hans was already dreaming of starting his own watch business, soaking up all the knowledge he could, and during this time, he also met Florence Frances May Crotty, who would soon become his wife. Then one day, Hans was just chilling outside with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, and were chatting about life and their dreams for the future. Hans was super into watches and had this big idea to start his own watch business. He was pretty confident about it, but just needed some cash to kick things off. Alfred, who had some money, saw how passionate Hans was about watches. Even though Hans was pretty young, Alfred decided to take a chance on him. He agreed to invest in Hans's business idea. They shook hands, and in 1905, they started Wilsdorf and Davis Limited, which later became Rolex. Now, these guys teamed up with a Swiss watch company called Hermann Egler in Switzerland. They began importing Swiss watch movements to England and putting them in watch cases. They also set up an office in Bienne, Switzerland, to strengthen their partnership. At that time, their main focus was on making quality watches that were also affordable. But Hans had a problem with the watch industry at the time. He wasn't a fan of pocket watches. Back then, wristwatches were mainly for women and weren't seen as very precise. Pocket watches were bigger and more popular and considered more masculine, but Hans found them pretty inconvenient to use, especially when his hands were busy. That's why Hans believed that wristwatches would eventually become the norm for everyone. He was determined to create the perfect wristwatch that was both accurate and easy to use every day. In 1914, he even said he thought pocket watches would almost completely disappear and that wristwatches would take over. So, Hans spent years traveling across Europe, meeting with watchmakers, and learning about the tiny details that make a great watch. He started releasing his own wristwatches, using what he learned to make them high quality and reliable for both men and women. His company started to gain popularity, and by 1908, it was one of the top names in the watchmaking industry in England. Now, this was when Hans had this idea. He wanted to rename his company to something really fancy, easy to remember, and something that sounds great in any language. Plus, it had to be short so it could fit nicely on a watch dial. After a lot of brainstorming and playing around with letters, he came up with Rolex. He knew right away it was the perfect name and soon registered it as a trademark for his company, Wilsdorf and Davis, in 1908. Rolex quickly became known for its top-notch wristwatches, and the rich folks started loving it. But then, World War I hit, and lots of businesses, including watchmakers, were struggling. But not Rolex. The war actually made Rolex even more popular because their reliable wristwatches were super handy for soldiers. It was easier and safer than pocket watches and really precise for timing their missions. By 1914, Rolex was booming, with 60 employees and big offices in London. They even got some prestigious awards for their watches, which made people trust the brand even more. But then, Britain put this huge tax on companies exporting goods, and since Hans was originally from Germany and his name sounded German, it was getting tough for him in England. So he moved Rolex's headquarters to Biel, Switzerland in 1915, and eventually changed the company's name to just Rolex Watch Corporation. In 1919, Rolex moved again, this time to Geneva, where they still are today. They started focusing on making the watch movements in Biel and then finishing them up in Geneva with their classy designs. Hans was all about making the perfect wristwatch. He wanted it to withstand dust, water, heat, everything, and his hard work paid off big time. In 1926, Rolex launched the Rolex Oyster, the first ever waterproof wristwatch. It was an absolute game changer. The case was super tight, protecting the inner workings and making it completely waterproof. Hans waited for the perfect moment to show off this revolutionary watch to the world in a super creative way. Then, in 1931, they totally wowed everyone with their new Rolex Oyster Perpetual, which became the first waterproof and self-winding wristwatch. Before that, winding a Rolex Oyster was a bit of a hassle. You had to unscrew the crown, wind it, and screw it back. Quite a task because of its snug case. But here's the cool part. Making a self-winding watch was a dream for centuries, and no one nailed it until Rolex did. Oh, and by the way, from 1934 to 1940, Hans Wilsdorf also made some top-notch watches under his own name. But he had to stop because at that time, people in France, Britain, and the US weren't keen on German products. This was when tough times started for Hans, especially with his German name. It made breaking into the market even harder. Then, World War II hit and things got rough for Rolex. Exporting watches became a huge challenge. To top it off, sadly, Hans lost his wife in 1944, and in her memory, he set up the Wilsdorf Foundation, which was a charity for social causes. Now, here's a kicker. Before Hans passed away, he gave 100% ownership of Rolex to this foundation. So Rolex will never be sold or go public, and it doesn't pay taxes, since it's technically a charity. Then, after World War II had finally ended, Rolex's popularity skyrocketed. In 1946, they had sold their 50,000th certified Rolex chronometer, and just a year later, they doubled that. Much of this success came from their new model in 1945, the Rolex Datejust, the first waterproof self-winding watch showing the date. And not long after, they introduced the Rolex Day Date, showing the day of the week, too. In the 1950s, Rolex kept impressing everyone. Their most legendary release was the Rolex Submariner in 1953, which was perfect for deep-sea diving without a hitch. After Hans died in 1960, Rolex started positioning itself as the luxury brand we know today, targeting high society. And it's actually true that they were the first to use 904L steel in 1985. That's why they're pricey yet so durable. Today, Rolex is the most famous watch brand globally. It's incredible how Hans Wilsdorf, starting as an orphan, revolutionized the watch industry, and his dedication to design and innovation has made him one of the industry's most influential figures. And that's all for today, folks. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more amazing content, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.